All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're looking at a fascinating legal case out of the Philippines. It's a story about where you draw the line between someone's personal faith and the laws that govern everyone. And believe me, it forces us to ask some really big questions about freedom and the power of the state. I want to start with this quote, because it's actually the opening line of the court decision we're talking about. While man is finite, he seeks and subscribes to the infinite. Wow. Right from the get-go, you know this isn't just about some dry legal rule. It's about something much deeper, that human need to connect with something bigger than ourselves. So let's dig in. So who is this all about? Well, at the very center of what turned into a legal battle that lasted a decade is one woman, Soledad Escritor. She worked as a court interpreter, a public servant, and her private life was about to become very, very public. So in 2000, a complaint gets filed against her, and it's pretty blunt. It accuses Ms. Escra Corporis of disgraceful and immoral conduct. Now, for anyone in the civil service, especially working in a courthouse, that is a huge deal. We're talking about a charge that could get her fired. And why? Because she was living with a man and they had a child together, but he was technically still married to someone else. And this, right here, is the heart of the matter. You've got the law on one side, the administrative code, saying her relationship is immoral. But on the other side, you have her faith. Ms. Escritor's defense was that her relationship wasn't just moral, it was officially recognized by her church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, through something called a declaration of pledging faithfulness. So what exactly is this declaration? Well, for Jehovah's Witnesses, it's a serious formal thing. See, if a member of the church gets abandoned by their spouse but can't legally get a divorce, this document allows them to start a new union that's considered totally valid and binding within their faith all around the world. So, in Soledad Escritor's eyes, this wasn't some casual affair. This was her marriage, recognized by her God and her entire religious community. And that leads us to the giant constitutional question the Philippine Supreme Court had to wrestle with. Can the government punish you for behavior that the law calls immoral when your deeply held religious beliefs say that it's perfectly moral? In other words, could she use her constitutional right to religious freedom as a shield? Okay, so to figure this out, the court had to do a bit of a history dive. They looked at where these ideas of religious freedom even came from, which meant looking at the legal history in the United States. And it turns out, when people talk about a wall of separation between church and state, they can mean two very different things. So you've got two camps, basically. First is strict neutrality. You can think of this wall as something built to protect the government from religion. The state doesn't get involved, it doesn't make exceptions, it just stays neutral. Then you have benevolent neutrality. This view flips the purpose of the wall. It says the wall is there to protect religion from the government. And under this idea, the state can, and maybe even should, bend its rules sometimes to make sure people can actually practice their faith. So the big question is, who is the wall for? And this debate wasn't just theoretical. It played out in the U.S. courts. For a long time, the courts had a really high standard for the government, this compelling state interest test. Basically, if a law messed with someone's religion, the government needed an incredibly good reason. But then, bam, in 1990, a case called Employment Division versus Smith just tossed that test out. It said, look, as long as a law is neutral and applies to everybody, tough luck for your religion. This created a huge fork in the road, and now the Philippine Supreme Court had to decide which way to go. And here's where things get really interesting. Because the court realized it couldn't just copy and paste the American approach. Why? Because the Philippine Constitution itself seemed to be pointing them in a completely different direction. You see, when they looked at their own constitution, they found some pretty clear clues. Unlike the U.S. version, the Philippine Constitution specifically allows for things like tax exemptions for churches and even optional religious classes in public schools. And get this, the very first line of their Constitution's preamble calls on the aid of Almighty God. These aren't just little details. They paint a picture of a system designed to accommodate religion, not ignore it. So, putting all that together, the court made a huge call. They declared that benevolent neutrality, that idea of accommodating religion, is the actual spirit of their constitution. They looked at that restrictive Smith decision from the U.S. and said, nope, that's not for us. They chose to go down a path that protects religious practice. Okay, so they've picked their philosophy, benevolent neutrality. Now they needed a tool, a specific legal standard, to actually apply it to Soledad Escritor's case. And they brought back that powerful standard we talked about earlier, the compelling state interest test. It's a three-step process, and it's really tough on the government. Step 1, Ms. Escritor had to show that the law was actually a burden on her sincere beliefs. Easy enough. But once she did that, the tables turned. Now the government had to prove two things. First, that its reason for the law was compelling. We're talking top tier, absolutely crucial. And second, that it used the least restrictive means to get what it wanted. That is an incredibly high bar to clear. So the stage is set, the test is chosen. The case actually got sent back down for the government to try and build its case. Years went by. Finally, in 2006, the Supreme Court was ready. It was time to apply the test and make a final call. Now, you have to understand the government's side here. They came out swinging. They argued their compelling interest was nothing less than protecting the very idea of marriage and family, the bedrock of society. They didn't mince words. They called her relationship utterly destructive to those institutions. You can feel the weight of that argument, right? The stakes were massive. But here's the million-dollar question. Is just saying you want to protect marriage enough? Did the state actually prove its case and meet that super high bar set by the test? Let's look at step 2 of the test, the compelling interest. The court basically said, not so fast. The government's argument was just too vague. It wasn't enough to talk about protecting marriage in general. They had to show how Soledad Escritor's specific relationship, this one union, was actually a threat. And they had zero evidence for that. In fact, the court pointed out that the government never even tried to charge her with a crime, which made their interest seem kind of symbolic, not truly compelling. And then we get to step 3, the least restrictive means. And this is where the government's case just completely crumbles. They had to prove that firing her was the only way to protect marriage. But you know what they presented to the court on this point? Nothing. Not a single piece of evidence. They didn't even explore other options. Their approach was just follow the rule or you're out. And with that, it was over. The Supreme Court handed down its final verdict. The complaint was dismissed. After a legal fight that took up almost a decade of her life, Soledad Escritor won. She kept her job, her family, and her faith. Her fundamental right to religious freedom came out on top. So this whole case leaves us with this huge, lingering question, one that's still so relevant today. When a person's sincere, personal faith crashes head-on into a law that's supposed to apply to everybody, who's supposed to give way? Should the individual bend, or should the state? It's a tough one, and while this case gives us one powerful answer, it's a debate that is definitely far from over.